Nathaniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened as the rain began to fall. His phone buzzed again, and this time, it was just a message from Rachel. "Nathaniel, don't worry. I'm sure everything is fine. Just wanted to keep you updated." But Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling in his gut. Something was wrong. He pushed the accelerator harder, his thoughts racing. Why hadn't he called his mother? Why had he kept his distance for so long? If you're ready to hear the whole story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as crazy as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let's get into it. Nathaniel Kingston was used to moving at the speed of business. As the CEO of one of the largest tech firms in the country, his days were a blur of meetings, contracts, and endless numbers. Today, like any other, was no different. Sitting in his corner office in downtown Manhattan, he clicked through emails, signed contracts, and finalized deals that would make his company millions more. He had everything he wanted, or at least everything he thought he wanted. But even as the world outside his office buzzed with the noise of his success, Nathaniel felt nothing. No satisfaction, no joy, just the usual hollow feeling that seemed to follow him everywhere. He glanced at his phone. Another email, another investor checking in. It was all just a blur of zeros and ones. The screen lit up with a text from his assistant. "Rachel, your mother's at the park again with Chris. Don't forget the charity gala tonight." Nathaniel rolled his eyes. His mom, Sarah, was always out there, somewhere in the city trying to make the world a better place. She didn't care about money, not like he did. She was busy helping people who didn't have what he had, people like Chris. Chris was a homeless teenager Sarah had met months ago. She'd taken him in, given him a job at the shelter she volunteered at, and helped him in ways Nathaniel couldn't understand. To him, Chris was just another reminder of the difference between their two worlds. The rich world he lived in, and the world his mother was so determined to fix. Nathaniel typed a quick reply to Rachel. "Tell her I'll be there later." He didn't have the energy to deal with his mother's latest charity mission. But part of him, somewhere deep down, felt that nagging sense of guilt. His mother had always been there for him, even when he didn't deserve it. But Nathaniel had always kept his distance, emotionally. It was easier that way. Emotions were messy. He didn't need to feel anything beyond the numbers, the bottom lines, the goals he set for himself. After all, success was everything. His wealth was proof that he was on top. But today felt different. Maybe it was the rain outside the office window, or the tension in the pit of his stomach. He felt restless, unsettled, as if something in his life was out of place. Maybe it was the thought of his mom sitting with Chris again. Maybe it was the reminder that despite all his money and power, he was still alone. He glanced at the clock. It was 3 p.m. already. The charity gala was in a few hours, and he needed to get ready. He closed his laptop, stood up from his desk, and grabbed his coat. But as he made his way to the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to see his mother. It had been a week since they'd spoken, and he couldn't remember the last time they'd really talked. Sure, he sent her birthday cards and the occasional check for the charity she supported, but it never felt like enough. Not like how she gave everything for others. He stepped outside, the city's hustle and bustle surrounding him. The sky was overcast, and the rain seemed to threaten, though it hadn't started yet. Nathaniel slid into his car, his mind still on Sarah. The phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. He pulled it out, expecting another work email, but instead, he saw a picture from Rachel. It was a photo of his mother sitting on a park bench, her arm around a young man, Chris. Nathaniel stared at the image, his brow furrowing. Chris looked like he always did, scruffy, a bit lost, but there was something different this time. His face was turned towards Sarah, but his eyes were tired, worn from life on the streets. And Sarah was smiling, her face warm with the same kindness Nathaniel had always known her for. But what caught his attention wasn't the picture. It was the caption that Rachel had sent with it. "She's always like this. I just don't get it. Do you?" Nathaniel's fingers tightened around the phone, his heart skipping a beat. Something didn't feel right. The way Chris was leaning against his mother, it wasn't just a friendly gesture. It looked like like he needed her, like he was holding on to her for more than just support. A knot formed in Nathaniel's stomach. Was Sarah in danger? He didn't stop to think. He grabbed his keys, threw open the door to his car, and slammed it shut. Without another word, he pulled out of the parking lot and headed toward the park. The same park Sarah had been visiting for years, volunteering at the shelter and helping anyone she could. Nathaniel's eyes shifted from Chris to his mother. There was something about the way they stood together that unsettled him. It wasn't just the casual closeness. It was the ease, the comfort they shared that felt so foreign to him. His mother had always been loving, but this was different. More than what he expected. "So, how've you been, Mom?" Nathaniel asked, trying to sound more relaxed than he felt. He shoved his hands in his pockets, though they felt too tight, like they were full of something he didn't want to acknowledge. His mother smiled. "Oh, you know me, keeping busy with my charity work. And Chris, he's been doing well. He's got a good heart, Nathaniel." Nathaniel glanced at Chris, who was standing quietly beside them. He looked younger than he'd imagined. No older than 18, maybe. His clothes were worn, the fabric frayed around the edges. But there was a certain calm in his demeanor, a quiet strength in the way he carried himself. Something that caught Nathaniel off guard. Chris spoke up, breaking the silence. "Your mom's been real kind to me, sir. Been helping me get back on my feet." Nathaniel forced a tight smile, nodding. "Glad to hear it." The small talk felt hollow. The words bounced around in the space between them, but neither of them seemed to know what to do with them. There was no easy way to bridge the gap between a billionaire's world and someone like Chris. Someone like him, Nathaniel thought. Someone who had nothing. Sarah must have sensed the awkwardness because her smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of concern. "Nathaniel, I know you've been busy, but I wish you would give this more thought. It's important. Helping people like Chris. It changes lives." Nathaniel's heart clenched at the words, though he tried to hide it. He wanted to argue, to tell her that she didn't understand how busy he was, how the weight of his company demanded his attention every minute of every day. But when he looked at her face, the softness in her eyes, something shifted. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, he saw Chris reach into his jacket pocket and pull something out. It was a crumpled, tattered envelope. Paper yellowed with age, the corners bent as though it had been carried for months, maybe years. Chris extended the envelope toward Nathaniel. This is for you." Nathaniel blinked, caught off guard. His eyes flickered between Chris and his mother, trying to piece together what was happening. Why was Chris handing him something? Why now? "What's this?" Nathaniel asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Chris hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering to Sarah before returning to Nathaniel. "It's a letter. From someone you knew. Someone who cared about you. Long before all this." Nathaniel frowned, his mind racing. A letter? From someone he knew? His hand hesitated over the paper, but something in Chris's eyes told him this wasn't a joke. It was too serious, too heavy. He took the letter, his fingers brushing against the worn paper. As soon as he touched it, a wave of unease washed over him. The letter felt like it carried a weight he wasn't ready to bear. "What's this about?" he asked again, his voice low, almost too quiet. Chris just shook his head, a faint look of sorrow in his eyes. "You'll understand when you read it." Nathaniel stared at the envelope, his breath catching in his throat. His mind buzzed with questions, none of which made sense. Why would Chris have something like this? What did it mean? His mother reached out gently, touching his arm. "Nathaniel, please, just open it." The words lingered in the air, thick with unspoken emotion. Nathaniel glanced at Sarah, her eyes full of a tenderness he couldn't ignore. She was asking him to trust her, to trust this moment. But there was something inside him that resisted. Something inside him that wanted to walk away, to leave the park, to go back to the familiar noise of his office, his company, his world. The world where things made sense, where he could control everything. But this felt like something else entirely. With a sigh, Nathaniel ripped open the envelope, his fingers trembling slightly, as he unfolded the crumpled letter inside. The writing was old-fashioned, the ink faded but still legible. He recognized the handwriting immediately. It was unmistakable. "Nathaniel," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then I've already gone. I'm sorry for the way things ended between us. I want you to know that I loved you like a son. I always will." The words hit him like a punch to the stomach. His throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. He turned the letter over, searching for more. The words seemed to blur, and the park around him faded into a dull hum. All he could focus on was the name at the bottom of the page. "You'll always be my family. Love, Betty." Nathaniel's heart stopped. He looked up at his mother, his mind struggling to catch up. Betty, the name that had haunted him for years. Betty had been his childhood nanny. She was the one who had always cared for him when his parents were too busy, the one who had made him feel safe when nothing else did. But years ago she had left without a word, left without saying goodbye. And now here was this letter, in the hands of a homeless kid he barely knew, bringing back memories he wasn't ready to face. His stomach twisted as the realization hit him. How could Betty know? Chris's eyes softened as he watched Nathaniel's reaction. "I know this is a lot to take in," he said quietly. "But it's true. Betty, she cared about you, and she wanted you to know that before it was too late." The world seemed to slow down as the weight of the letter pressed down on Nathaniel's chest. He was drowning in the silence that followed, unable to speak, unable to move. And then, finally, he said the only thing he could manage. How do you know Betty?" Chris hesitated for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because Betty's my mother." Nathaniel stood there, the letter still crumpled in his hands, his mind racing. He was barely aware of the park around him, the chirping of birds, the laughter of children, the occasional car honking in the distance. All of it felt like a distant hum. His eyes were fixed on Chris, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Betty's son? How could that be? The idea didn't fit, didn't belong in the neat, predictable world Nathaniel had built for himself. It was impossible. Couldn't be true. For a long moment no one spoke. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Nathaniel's mother, standing beside him, looked as if she were about to say something, but she held back, waiting for him to speak first. "Chris," Nathaniel finally managed, his voice strained, like the words had to force their way out. You're Betty's son?" Chris nodded, his expression unreadable. There was no bitterness, no anger, just a quiet acceptance in his gaze, as though he had said this 1,000 times before, but it still didn't make it any easier. Nathaniel's heart was pounding. This isn't real. This can't be real. He tried to swallow the tightness in his throat, but it wouldn't go away. Why didn't you tell me?" Nathaniel asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" "I didn't know how to," Chris said, his voice steady but with a quiet pain that Nathaniel could hear in every word. I didn't know how to come to you, Nathaniel. I didn't know how to tell you." Nathaniel stared at him, still processing everything. This was impossible. Betty, the woman who had raised him, who had cared for him when his parents had been too busy. She had a son. A son who had grown up without the privilege Nathaniel had. A son who was now standing in front of him, a homeless teenager. His mind raced to all the things he had thought about his life. The wealth, the success, the status. He had spent his entire life building a fortress around himself. And now it was cracking wide open. There was a rawness to everything that he didn't know how to handle. He looked over at his mother. Her face was soft with compassion. But there was something in her eyes, something that told him she wasn't surprised. She had known this was coming. She had known all along. "You knew." Nathaniel's voice was tight. "You knew about him? About Betty?" Sarah nodded slowly. "I knew, Nathaniel. Betty was part of our lives for so long. I never wanted to tell you, but I couldn't keep it from you forever." He felt a wave of frustration wash over him, a cold knot in his stomach. "And you thought it was okay to just let me find out like this?" To just throw this on me? Do you have any idea what this does to me? His mother's eyes darkened. Her lips pressed together. She didn't say anything for a long time. Instead, she just stood there, looking at him, as if weighing whether to say more. Then she finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. You've been so caught up in your world, Nathaniel. So wrapped up in your success, your company, that you've forgotten what really matters. People matter. Real connections matter. Nathaniel opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. His throat felt tight, and his chest ached. He didn't know how to respond. The words were foreign to him. People matter? That was something his life had never been about. His life had been about numbers, deals, power. It had been about controlling everything, making sure everything was in order. And yet, here was Chris, standing in front of him with a simple, raw truth. Chris didn't care about money. He didn't care about status. He cared about family, about people. Nathaniel shook his head, his hand running through his hair in frustration. I don't know what you want from me, Mom. I don't know how to fix this. Not everything can be fixed, Nathaniel, Sarah replied softly. Sometimes, you have to just be with it. And that's okay. You don't have to have all the answers right away. Nathaniel looked back at Chris, who stood there, still as a statue, waiting for him to make the next move. Chris's eyes held no resentment. There was no anger in him, just the quiet acceptance of someone who had been through things Nathaniel couldn't even begin to understand. Finally, Nathaniel let out a breath, his body heavy with the weight of the moment. He tried to speak, but the words were hard to form. How do you even begin to respond to something like this? Chris stepped forward slightly, breaking the silence. I know you probably don't understand any of this. I get that. I just wanted you to know who I am, to know why I'm here. You've been living on the streets, Nathaniel said, the pieces slowly clicking into place. He had seen Chris standing near the park on several occasions, sitting by the fountain or near the benches, sometimes alone, sometimes with others. But now the reality of who he was, of what his life had been like, hit Nathaniel hard. Yeah, Chris replied quietly. It hasn't been easy, but I'm trying to make something of it. Your mom's been helping me. I'm trying to get back on my feet. Nathaniel felt something twist inside him. Helping him. His mother had been helping Chris. But Nathaniel hadn't even noticed. He had been so wrapped up in his own world that he hadn't seen what was right in front of him. But as the anger began to dissipate, it was replaced with something else. A growing sense of guilt. He had turned a blind eye to the people in his life who needed him. He had let his wealth and power cloud his view of everything else. And now he was standing in front of the very person his mother had been helping, a person who carried a past he knew nothing about, and it left him feeling small. Do you need help? Nathaniel asked, his voice quieter than before. It felt like the first time he had spoken honestly in a long time. Chris gave a small shrug, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something Nathaniel couldn't quite place. Maybe, but I'm not asking for charity, if that's what you mean. Nathaniel nodded, his heart heavy but his mind clearer. Maybe this wasn't about charity. Maybe it was about something deeper. I'm not sure where this goes, Nathaniel admitted, but I'm willing to find out. And for the first time, he wasn't just talking about the situation. He was talking about himself, about what he needed to change, what he needed to fix. Chris gave him a small, knowing smile. Then let's start with this, he said, pulling something small from his pocket. You don't have to do this alone. Nathaniel wasn't sure how he ended up at the old diner on the corner of Maple Street. It wasn't a place he would have ever chosen. His life didn't have room for greasy food and sticky booths. But his mother had asked him to meet Chris here, and he couldn't bring himself to say no. As he parked his car and walked inside, the bell on the door jingled above him, and the smell of frying onions and fresh coffee hit him like a wave. A far cry from the high-end restaurants he was used to. He felt out of place, like an outsider who didn't belong. But that was the point, wasn't it? He spotted Chris right away, sitting in a booth near the window, his hands wrapped around a chipped coffee cup. Nathaniel hesitated for a second. Chris didn't look like the guy who'd changed his life. He looked like any other kid trying to get by, young, worn, with a distant look in his eyes. Nathaniel didn't know what to say. How did you even start a conversation with someone you barely knew? Someone who, just a few days ago, had been a complete stranger. Chris looked up, meeting Nathaniel's gaze, and for a moment, there was no awkwardness. It was just two people, alone in the same room, sharing an understanding that hadn't existed before. "You're here?" Chris said quietly, his voice rough, like he hadn't spoken much lately. Nathaniel nodded, sliding into the seat across from him. The booth creaked under his weight. "Yeah, my mom said you needed some help." Chris raised an eyebrow. "Your mom's the one who offered help. I'm just trying to make sense of it all." He took a slow sip of his coffee, avoiding Nathaniel's gaze. The words hung between them, heavy and uncertain. Nathaniel didn't know where to start, so he did what he knew best. He deflected. "How are you holding up?" he asked, though it sounded more like an obligation than a question. Chris gave him a half-smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm surviving. Like I said, I'm not asking for charity. I just need something real. Something that doesn't come with strings attached." Nathaniel didn't know how to respond. "I didn't think you were asking for charity," he muttered, pushing his water glass back and forth on the table. "But I don't know what you want from me either, or if I even can help." Chris chuckled bitterly. "You're not the first person to say that. Everyone thinks they can fix something with money, but they can't." He shook his head. "Money doesn't fix everything, Nathaniel." The words cut through him, sharper than he expected. He had spent his whole life believing that if he had enough money, he could solve any problem. And here was Chris saying it didn't work that way. That money wasn't the answer. Nathaniel had no idea how to respond to that. His whole world had been built on the idea that money was the answer. "I didn't ask for your pity, you know," Chris added, noticing Nathaniel's silence. "And I don't need it. I just wanted a shot at something better. I don't know if that's possible anymore. But I'm here. I'm trying." Nathaniel swallowed hard. He felt a weight settle in his chest, one he hadn't been able to shake all day. "You think you're the only one with problems?" he blurted out before he could stop himself. "I've spent my whole life being told that everything I want is just a phone call away, that if I play my cards right, I can have everything. But nothing feels real. Nothing feels like it matters." Chris looked up, his eyes locking onto Nathaniel's for the first time. "Yeah? So what? You're telling me you're the same as me? That you're just as lost?" Nathaniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. Was he? Was he just as lost? He had all the things people wanted: money, power, success. But none of it felt like it mattered. Felt like a house built on sand. "Look," Chris said, his voice quieter now. "I don't want to be some charity case, but I've learned something these last few years. I've learned that people don't change until they stop hiding. They don't change until they're forced to see what's really broken." Nathaniel's jaw clenched. It was as if Chris could see straight through him, cutting through all the armor he had carefully built over the years. For a second, Nathaniel felt exposed, vulnerable, like he was the one on the edge. "You're right," Nathaniel muttered, looking down at the chipped table. "I've been hiding behind money, behind my business, behind my reputation. And I don't even know who I am anymore." Chris leaned back in his seat, eyeing him with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. "Then maybe it's time to stop hiding." He paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. "You can't fix me, Nathaniel, but maybe you can fix yourself." The words hit Nathaniel like a punch to the gut. Fix himself? How could he fix something that was so far beyond repair? But in that moment, as Chris looked at him with an intensity that was almost too much to bear, Nathaniel felt a flicker of something. Maybe hope, maybe dread. "I don't know where to even start," Nathaniel admitted, his voice small now, almost lost. "But I guess I'm willing to try." Chris's gaze softened just a fraction, and for the first time since they had met, Nathaniel felt like he wasn't entirely alone. "You start by not running away," Chris said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You start by being here, right now, not trying to fix everything, but just Being. Nathaniel nodded, his chest tight, but there was something else there now. Something that wasn't fear. Something that felt like a chance. And for the first time in a long time, Nathaniel felt like he wasn't just running through life on autopilot. He was standing still, facing it head-on. Chris looked at him with an intensity that Nathaniel had never seen before. "You said you were willing to try. Are you sure? Because once you open this door, there's no going back." The diner was quieter now, the afternoon rush dying down as the last few customers sipped their coffee, deep in conversation. Nathaniel and Chris sat in the same booth, but the space between them felt wider than ever. The conversation had slowed to an uncomfortable silence, both men lost in their own thoughts. Nathaniel could feel the weight of what Chris had said, the quiet truth in his words. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting inside him, like he was finally being forced to look at the things he'd been running from for years. Chris stared out the window, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, not saying a word. Nathaniel's eyes drifted to the worn menu in front of him, though he wasn't really reading it. His mind was racing. The things he'd never talked about, the things he'd hidden deep inside, were starting to rise to the surface. "You know," Nathaniel said, his voice rougher than he intended, "I don't know how to fix this. How to fix anything." Chris didn't look at him. "You don't fix things by running from them," he said quietly. "You fix them by facing them." Nathaniel closed his eyes for a second, the words hitting harder than he expected. They felt like a slap in the face, like he had just been called out for every mistake, every choice he had made that led him here. The thing was, he didn't know how to face those things, how to fix himself. "I didn't ask for any of this," Nathaniel muttered, his hands tightening on the edge of the table. "The money, the business, it all just happened. I didn't have a choice." Chris finally turned to look at him, his eyes still distant, but now there was something more, something softer. "I don't think you ever asked for it, Nathaniel. But maybe it's time to ask yourself why you're holding on to it. What are you afraid of losing?" Nathaniel's heart skipped. The question hung in the air like a challenge. What was he afraid of? He had everything, a name that people recognized, power, wealth, but it never felt real, never felt like it meant anything. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't know anymore." Chris leaned back, his voice growing even quieter. "You think I wanted to be homeless? You think I wanted to end up on the streets, begging for change?" Nathaniel froze. He hadn't expected Chris to open up like this, to say something so personal. "No, I didn't think that." Chris took a breath, the weight of his words hanging between them. "I didn't have a choice either, you know. One day I had a family, place to stay. The next I didn't. Everything I knew just disappeared." He ran a hand through his hair, the frustration in his voice clear now. "You want to know what it's like to have everything ripped away from you? It's like you're nothing, like nobody cares." Nathaniel felt something tighten in his chest. He had heard about homelessness, seen it in the news, but hearing it from Chris, hearing it like this, raw and unfiltered, it hit differently. The gap between their worlds wasn't as wide as he thought. "I'm sorry," Nathaniel said quietly, genuinely for the first time. "I never understood." Chris nodded, but there was no satisfaction in it. Nobody does. Not until it happens to them. A silence fell over them again, this one even heavier than before. Nathaniel wanted to say something, something to make it better, to make it right. But he didn't know what. There was no magic fix. There was no easy answer. "So what now?" Nathaniel finally asked, the question hanging in the air. "Where do we go from here?" Chris looked up at him, a flicker of something. Maybe hope, maybe pain, crossing his face. "I don't know. But maybe we start by not pretending everything's fine. By not hiding." Nathaniel nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his own truth. He had spent his whole life hiding, pretending that the world he had built was everything he needed. But it wasn't. It never had been. "I don't want to keep hiding," Nathaniel said, the words feeling like they were finally coming from a place of honesty. "I don't know how to fix everything. I don't even know if I can. But I want to try. I want to stop pretending." Chris didn't answer right away. He just stared at Nathaniel, the two of them sharing a moment of understanding that didn't need words. There was something unspoken between them now, something raw, something real. Finally, Chris spoke, his voice quieter than before. It's not about fixing things, Nathaniel. It's about being real with yourself. And with the people who matter. Nathaniel let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, his mind racing. He wasn't sure where to go from here, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he might actually be ready to start. To be real. Nathaniel leaned back in the booth, his mind a whirl of confusion and clarity all at once. He was about to say something, when Chris spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. You can't keep running from this. You're gonna have to face it sooner or later. Nathaniel's heart raced. He wasn't sure he was ready. But he knew one thing. The choice was no longer his to make. The cold rain fell in heavy sheets outside the diner. Nathaniel sat by the window, watching the droplets race each other down the glass, his mind a blur. It was one of those rare moments when the world outside seemed to match how he felt inside. Heavy, suffocating, out of control. Chris was still sitting across from him, but the distance between them felt like miles. The tension in the air was thick, and Nathaniel wasn't sure how much longer he could pretend that everything was okay. So, what now? Chris's voice cut through the silence, a little sharper than usual. Nathaniel took a deep breath, but his words caught in his throat. He had been thinking about that exact question for days now, but he didn't have an answer. He wasn't even sure what the question meant anymore. Was it about fixing everything with his mother? Was it about trying to salvage what little was left of his relationship with Chris? Or was it about something deeper? Something that had been festering inside him for years? Chris shifted in his seat, clearly growing impatient. Are you just gonna sit there and pretend this is fine? Like we're not standing on the edge of something huge here? Nathaniel didn't answer. He didn't know how to. The anger in Chris's voice hit him harder than he expected. It made him feel like a failure, like he was losing control of everything. He wanted to yell back, to defend himself, but something in Chris's words kept him still. I'm not pretending, Nathaniel finally said, his voice quieter than he wanted it to be. I don't know how to fix it. Chris let out a frustrated sigh, his fingers drumming on the table. It's not about fixing things, Nathaniel. It's about doing something. About taking responsibility for the mess we've made. Nathaniel's heart tightened. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't ask for all this money, all this power. You think that makes it easier? You think that gives you an excuse? Chris's words cut through him like a blade. Nathaniel felt the sting of it, but he knew Chris was right. What good was money if you couldn't even hold a decent conversation with the people you cared about? What good was power if it left you feeling more alone than ever? Nathaniel started, but the words didn't come out right. Chris leaned back in his seat, his face unreadable. You're always hiding behind your money, hiding behind your business. But none of that matters when the people you care about are slipping through your fingers. Nathaniel swallowed hard. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to face the truth about himself, about the way he had been living his life. But Chris wasn't backing down. I know you've been through a lot. I get it, I do, Chris continued, his voice softer now but no less pointed. But you can't just keep running, Nathaniel. You can't keep pretending like everything's fine when it's not. Nathaniel's chest tightened. He wanted to stand up, to leave, to do anything to avoid this conversation. But deep down he knew he couldn't. Not anymore. Not if he wanted to fix things. I didn't mean to hurt you, Nathaniel said, the words raw and full of guilt. Chris looked at him, his eyes searching. You didn't just hurt me. You hurt yourself, too. You've been so busy trying to prove something. Prove you're not your father. Prove you're not some spoiled kid. That you've forgotten what really matters. There it was. The truth. The thing Nathaniel had been trying to avoid for so long. He had been so focused on keeping up appearances, on building an empire, on proving he was worthy, that he had lost sight of what really mattered, people. Relationships. Love. A silence fell between them, but this one was different. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was just heavy. Nathaniel stared out the window, watching the rain continue to fall. Everything seemed so far away now. His money, his business, his status. It all felt so empty. "I don't know what to do," Nathaniel whispered, more to himself than to Chris. "I don't know how to make it right." Chris didn't respond right away. He just sat there watching him, waiting. And in that moment, Nathaniel realized something. This was it. This was the turning point. He could keep running, keep hiding behind his wealth and status, or he could face what he had been avoiding. "I've spent my whole life trying to be someone I'm not," Nathaniel said finally, his voice shaking. "I've spent my whole life pretending that everything was perfect. But it's not. It never was." Chris didn't smile, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the pain they both shared. "It's never perfect for anyone, man," he said softly. "You just have to decide if you want to keep pretending or if you want to change." Nathaniel looked at him, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but deep down he knew there was no going back. "Maybe it's time to stop pretending," Nathaniel said, his voice filled with a quiet resolution. Chris gave a small nod. "You can't keep running from this, Nathaniel. You're going to have to face it. It's the only way forward." The sun had started to dip below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the city. Nathaniel leaned against the railing of the rooftop bar, looking out at the sprawling view of downtown. It was the kind of view that usually made him feel invincible, the tall glass buildings, the endless possibilities. But tonight it just felt hollow. The weight of the conversation with Chris still hung heavy on him. They hadn't talked much since that night at the diner. Nathaniel hadn't been able to stop thinking about it, about everything Chris had said. And for the first time he realized something he had never truly understood. He had been running. Running from his own fears. Running from the idea that maybe he wasn't as strong as he thought. The door behind him opened, and Chris stepped out onto the rooftop, looking uneasy. Nathaniel didn't turn around at first. He didn't need to see his face to know the weight that both of them were carrying. "I've been thinking a lot," Chris said, his voice quiet, hesitant. Nathaniel nodded but didn't respond. He wasn't sure what to say. Part of him wanted to push Chris away, keep the distance, but another part of him, the part he'd been hiding for so long, wanted to pull him closer. He wasn't sure what that meant yet, but he knew he couldn't keep pretending anymore. Chris stepped up next to him, staring out at the same view, but this time the silence didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt like they were both carrying the same burden, waiting for the other to take the first step. "You're right," Chris said finally. "I don't want to fight anymore, Nathaniel. I don't want to pretend like things are fine when they're not." Nathaniel didn't look at him. His voice came out soft but full of emotion. "I've been hiding from this my whole life. From you. From everything." He paused. "I don't know how to fix it. I don't even know where to begin." Chris let out a small breath, shaking his head. "You don't have to fix everything. You just have to be." Nathaniel turned to him now, his eyes meeting Chris's. For the first time he really saw him, the man who had stuck by him through everything, even when Nathaniel had been too busy trying to build his empire to notice. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the status. It was about someone who cared enough to show up, even when it would have been easier to walk away. "All I've ever done is work," Nathaniel said, his voice cracking. "I've buried myself in it. It's easier that way. But I can't hide anymore." Chris's eyes softened. "You don't have to be perfect, Nathaniel. I don't need you to be the big-shot billionaire. I need you to be real, to be here, with me." For a long moment, Nathaniel stayed silent. His mind was racing. He wanted to say something, but the words felt heavy, like they were stuck somewhere deep inside him. The walls he'd built up over the years were crumbling, and for the first time he felt the urge to feel instead of just thinking. He wasn't used to this kind of vulnerability. But Chris was standing right there, and Nathaniel realized something. Chris wasn't asking for perfection. He was asking for the truth, for honesty. "I'm scared," Nathaniel whispered. "I'm scared that if I let go of all this, my control, my business, if I just open up, I'll lose it all. I'll lose everything." Chris stepped closer, his hand on Nathaniel's arm, grounding him. "You're not going to lose me. You're not going to lose yourself. You just have to take the leap. You have to trust me. And trust yourself. Nathaniel looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time he felt like he could actually breathe. He had been so scared of losing control, so scared of showing weakness, that he hadn't seen the strength in the vulnerability. The truth was, this was the way forward. I don't know if I can change overnight, Nathaniel said, his voice thick with emotion. You don't have to change overnight, Chris replied. It's not about changing. It's about being honest. With me. With your mom. With yourself. Nathaniel nodded, his throat tight. He still didn't have all the answers, but something in him was shifting. He felt it deep inside. It wasn't easy. It wouldn't be easy. But maybe, just maybe, it was worth it. I'm scared too, Chris admitted, his voice quiet. I'm scared that all of this, he waved his hand vaguely, won't matter, that you'll pull away again, that we'll end up right back where we started. Nathaniel turned to him fully now, his eyes meeting Chris's. I don't want that, he said, his voice firm. I don't want to keep running. Not anymore. Chris's face softened, and he reached out, placing a hand on Nathaniel's shoulder. Then we face it together. We face whatever comes next. No running. Nathaniel took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long time he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this wasn't the end of the world. Maybe it was just the beginning of something new. But he knew one thing for sure now. The path ahead wasn't about fixing everything. It was about facing it together. The morning light filtered softly through the tall windows of Nathaniel's apartment, casting long shadows across the polished floors. For the first time in a long time, the space didn't feel empty. Felt full. Nathaniel sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in hand, staring out at the city below. He had been up since dawn, reflecting on everything that had happened. The weight he had carried for so many years was finally starting to lift. The walls he'd built around himself, around his heart, were no longer holding him prisoner. There had been a time when this city, this apartment, everything he had built felt like a fortress. But now it felt like a home, a real home. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Chris. Can we talk? I'm downstairs. Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat. He didn't need to read it again. He knew what that meant. He set the coffee down and stood, a strange mix of nerves and excitement swirling inside him. He grabbed his jacket and walked to the door, pausing for a moment to steady himself. His mind replayed the conversation from the rooftop the night before, and the words Chris had said echoed in his head. No more running. Nathaniel opened the door and found Chris standing just outside, his hands in his pockets, a slight nervousness in his posture. But when their eyes met, everything else seemed to fade away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need. They had already said everything that mattered. They had already opened the door to healing, to the future. Chris smiled, though it was a little hesitant. I was thinking, maybe we could get breakfast? Like a real, normal breakfast. Nathaniel chuckled. Felt so simple, but it was everything. They had spent so much time in tension, in turmoil, in uncertainty. Now, the idea of something as simple as breakfast together felt like the most meaningful thing in the world. I'd like that, Nathaniel said, his voice soft but full of warmth. They walked down to the street together, side by side, the early morning sun making everything feel new. It was a quiet walk, but it was filled with something unspoken, a kind of understanding between them that hadn't been there before. Nathaniel wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't afraid of losing Chris. He wasn't afraid of losing himself. They reached a small diner on the corner, the kind of place you could only find in a quiet neighborhood, where the waitress knew your name and the coffee was always fresh. Nathaniel pushed open the door, and they slid into a booth by the window, the familiar scent of sizzling bacon and fresh pancakes filling the air. Chris grinned across the table at him. This is nice. Nathaniel smiled back, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Yeah, it is. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds being the clink of silverware on plates and the hum of the diner around them. Felt right. Felt like the beginning of something real. After a while, Nathaniel set his fork down and looked at Chris, his gaze steady and sure. I've spent so much time trying to control everything. My business, my life, my emotions. I thought that's what made me strong. He paused, the words coming out slower now, but with conviction. But the truth is, I was running. Running from what I was really afraid of. Chris looked at him, his expression open, waiting. I was afraid that if I let myself care, if I let anyone in, I'd lose everything I worked for. But now, I see it's the opposite. Caring is what makes life worth living. Chris reached across the table, placing his hand on Nathaniel's. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was simple, but in that moment it meant everything. You're not perfect, Chris said quietly. Neither of us are. But that's okay. What matters is that we're here. We're together. Nathaniel felt his throat tighten, the weight of everything finally hitting him. The fear, the regret, the mistakes. They were all part of him, part of the journey that had led him here. But what mattered now was where they went from here. What mattered was moving forward, together. I don't know what the future holds, Nathaniel said, his voice raw but full of sincerity. But I know I want to face it with you. I want to see what's next. Chris squeezed his hand, and in that simple gesture, Nathaniel felt a kind of peace he hadn't known in years. It wasn't about having all the answers. It was about trusting the process, trusting each other. Then let's see what's next, Chris replied softly. Together. Later that evening, Nathaniel and Chris walked back to the apartment, hand in hand. The city around them was alive with lights, the streets buzzing with people, but in that moment, everything felt quiet. They didn't need to say anything. They just walked, side by side, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. No more running. For the first time in a long time, Nathaniel felt truly at peace. The world was full of unknowns, full of challenges, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't facing it alone anymore. And that made all the difference. Do you believe some people are worth the wait? Drop a heart in the comments if this story hit you. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.